Well, hello, everybody. Welcome back to our Marijuana Law 2020 conference. Welcome to panel number 4 of our 8 panels. This panel is called Historical Perspectives on Marijuana Prohibition. And we have, the panel only has 2 panelists, but they are fantastic. And I'm really looking forward to this panel and to the conversation that we'll have after the presentations are done. I just want to briefly introduce the 2 panelists, and then I'll turn it over to them. I just want to let everybody know that while the panelists are speaking, if you have questions, you should feel free, and please do put your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And when the presentations are over, I will moderate a question and answer period using your questions that I see in that box. So please do put your questions in there as they occur to you. So our panelists today we have 2 panelists. Emily Duftin is a writer, a researcher, and a drug historian with a PhD in American Studies from George Washington University. She often serves as a media commentator on marijuana history and policy, and most importantly, she's the author of this amazing book, Grassroots, which is just extraordinary. So if you're interested in this subject, I highly, highly recommend this volume. She's also working on a second book on medically assisted, the history of medically assisted treatment, I think, if I got that right, which is expected in 2022 thereabouts. Our second panelist is George Fisher. He's a professor of law at Stanford Law School, teaches and writes about criminal law and evidence, and was in fact my evidence professor 20-something years ago, 1996, I think, or 7. I actually learned that he was interested in the history of drug and policy and marijuana policy at my 20th law school reunion, and was delighted to learn about that, and so excited that he's here to join us. His talk today is part of a larger project which will culminate in a book that will be called Euphoria Taboo: The Moral Roots and Racial Myths of America's War on Drugs. So with that, I will turn it over to Emily Duftin. Thanks so much.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. Thanks, Jay, for putting this together. This is a super, super cool, super cool project. Let's see if I can share my slides here. I apologize for not currently being on video. I have kind of a terrible internet connection in my office, which is not ideal. But if I keep my video off, then it's slightly better for my connection. Can you see my slides now? Is it sharing?
No, we can't see it. Can't see the slides yet.
Okay, let me try again.
That looks good.
Aha, gotcha. Okay, all right, let's do view. So now can you see them? Is that cool?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Super. Okay. All right. So this is the pot law pendulum. So a little over a week ago, there was an election that I'm sure you're probably all aware of. And among the chaos, one thing really stood out, which is that the big winner of the 2020 election, much as it was in the 2016 election, was weed. Voters in New Jersey, Arizona, South Dakota, and Montana legalized recreational use, bringing the number of legalized states up to 15, and voters in South Dakota and Mississippi legalized medical use, South Dakota being the first state to legalize medical and recreational simultaneously, bringing the number of medical states up to 35. That meant that after last Tuesday, 16 million more Americans now live where adults are legally allowed to use pot, and that's joining 93 million others, which means that over 1 in 3 Americans now live where adults have access to marijuana in some form. And as you can also see, only 2 states have firm prohibition, but even Nebraska has at least decriminalized. So that leaves Idaho alone. It also shows that feelings in this country about legalizing pot are constantly changing. The graph at the top of this screen here is from Gallup. It's very recent. And it shows that a high of 68% Americans now approve the legalization of pot. And below is a headline from Politico, another recent one that says that 1 in 3 Americans now live in a state where pot is legal. And I should note right now that I use a variety of terms to discuss cannabis. It's actually one of my favorite things about this topic is the number of hilarious nicknames that this drug has. And I can explain why I am okay with using marijuana, cannabis, pot, weed interchangeably in the Q&A if you're interested. Anyway, it's fun to talk about these changes with legal scholars because legalization, of course, is a fundamentally legal issue. It's a matter of changing laws. But I'm coming to this conference as a scholar of culture, specifically American culture. And what I can offer to this crowd is the history of how these laws changed. Because a lot of people think that legalization is a done deal right now. It's a fait accompli. But people thought that in the late 1970s too, and it didn't happen. And that's because, as I argue in my book, that pot laws exist on a pendulum that swings back and forth between demonization and acceptance. And it has done this a number of times where it has swung between criminalization to decriminalization to legalization. And I'm not entirely sure that it won't swing again. And the reason that it swings is because of the work of thousands of grassroots activists over the past 50 years. Parents, lawyers, activists, anti-war activists, a number of individuals who came together to push laws in either a direction of greater acceptance or greater restrictions. So I'm going to give you the quick and dirty history of 50 years of grassroots activism to change cannabis laws. And it all begins right here with this man, Lowell Eggemeyer. On August 16, 1964, when Eggemeyer was 28 years old, he walked into the San Francisco Hall of Justice, lit up a joint, and asked to be arrested, which he was immediately. And he does this because in 1964, marijuana's legal status in America is really mixed. There's no federal law against the drug, but the federal government's general stance hadn't really changed that much since the 1936 film Reefer Madness. So of course it's ironic that Eggemeyer and Reefer Madness debuted in the same year. That marijuana will make you go crazy, you'll commit suicide or murder, or worse, imagination, you'll immediately get addicted to heroin, etc. There were state laws against the drug, and they varied. In California, pot was a felony, and Eggemeyer was incarcerated for a year because of his. Now, he's probably not who you might expect to be the first decriminalization activist. You kind of have to keep in mind that in 1964, we're 3 years before the Summer of Love. It's before the sort of the hippies wearing their bells and their beads have arrived in the Haight-Ashbury. Eggemeyer did this because, as he told me, he actually felt it was really a civil rights issue. So while he's incarcerated, he gets a lawyer named James R. Whiteford. He's another fascinating figure because he's a libertarian, which he described as to the right of Barry Goldwater. And he's interested in this case because he sees Eggemeyer's action as a matter of freedom, and he defends him pro bono. White's also a researcher, and to defend Eggemeyer, he finds these old government reports that contradict its current reefer madness stance. These include the Indian Hemp Drugs Commission of 1894, the Panama Canal Zone Commission of 1925, among others, and they all report that marijuana is both less toxic and less habit-forming than alcohol or tobacco. So by showing that the federal government once felt this way, White argues that modern laws against marijuana were unconstitutional and that his client did not deserve to be jailed for its use. To raise money for his cause, White also started printing his findings in these mini hand-illustrated pamphlets you see there on the left, which he called Marijuana Puffin or a variety of other names. And these circulated widely among the proto-hippies in the San Francisco area. He also started a group called LEMAR, which is a contraction of legalized marijuana. And LEMAR rallies joined up with groups like the Grateful Dead and the Charlatans to play music, rally for legalization, and spread the gospel of the government's unfair punishment of this drug. So with help from celebrities like Allen Ginsberg, who you see in the top center, LEMAR quickly spread across the country, not because more people were smoking pot and felt it should be legal, but because of its connection to the growing counterculture. Questioning marijuana's legal status aligned with other growing social concerns at the time, Because as White was pointing out, the government could lie. His reports showed that either the government was lying when it said pot wasn't that bad in its earlier reports, or it was lying now with its continued Reefer Madness campaign. And the sense that the government was lying permeated other realms too. Young people started questioning that if the government was lying when it said that prohibition was necessary, was it also lying when it said that segregation was necessary, or that America was winning the war in Vietnam? This questioning of the government's official stance fueled growing social dissent, and it swept legalization up in the SAVE movement that launched enormous anti-war marches and civil rights demonstrations. So the initial movement for legalization was a moment of historical kismet with a larger growing dissatisfaction of what the federal government was doing and questioning its motivations. Nixon is elected president in 1968, and he realizes the threat this growing counterculture poses to his administration. He wants to stop rallies from forming on the Mall, but he can't arrest dissenters because that's the First Amendment. So instead, he starts trying to find another way where he could essentially penalize countercultural activists. And he realizes that by passing drug legislation, that is one way to nail his dissidents. So that's what he does. In 1970, he works with his Attorney General, John Mitchell, who's there on the right holding the document, to lobby very hard to pass the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, which you probably know for 5 schedules of drugs. Moving from 1 to 5, they rank drugs according to 2 criteria, which is if the drug has medical usage and it's and 1 is the most dangerous to 5, which is the least dangerous. And Nixon and Mitchell lobby very hard to have marijuana placed in Schedule 1. Because Congress is somewhat reticent to accept this, they also set up the Schaefer Commission, or the National Commission on Marijuana and Drug Abuse, headed by the man in the center there next to Nixon, Raymond Schaefer, the former Republican governor of Pennsylvania. This 13-member commission was going to be given 2 years, from 1970 to 1972, to research the depth and determine its effects. Nixon, of course, hoped that they would find out horrible things about the drug and that everyone would realize the threat it poses to the safety and security of the country, and that children should stop using it, everyone should stop using it right away. And he felt that he was going to get this response because Schaefer was aiming for a federal judgeship. And I think Nixon assumed a quid pro quo. He would give Schaefer the judgeship, and Schaefer would give him the report that he desired. But this is not what happens. You can kind of sense the tone of their findings when you read the title of the book, which is Marijuana, A Signal of Misunderstanding. This is Schaefer delivering the report in 1972 to Nixon. The most fascinating thing about this picture is that the woman to Nixon's right is named Joan Gans Cooney, and she is responsible for bringing Children's Television Workshop and Sesame Street to the world. She was the executive of Children's Television Workshop and has done more good for the world than I think anyone else in that picture. She's also the only woman, and she was a Democrat, so that was how they had some diversity on their otherwise rather monolithic commission there. So marijuana, A Signal of Misunderstanding, essentially says that the federal government should not take much concern about this drug. People who use pot versus people who do not, they're no more violent, they're no more aggressive, they're no more lazy. The greater threats to the United States are alcohol and heroin, and the federal government should assume that marijuana is its least important priority, and the drug should be federally decriminalized. Not legalized, but decriminalized. So you're probably asking yourself, gee, if Nixon and Mitchell suggested that marijuana should be a Schedule I drug, not permanently, just pending the result, why in the world is it still a Schedule I drug? And the answer to that question is Richard Nixon, who took the findings of the Schaefer Commission and basically threw them out the window. This is one of my all-time favorite editorial cartoons of, Nixon pounding his fists on the Oval Office desk saying, "Don't confuse me with the facts," to an aide has the Schaefer Commission's final report. He basically said that the commission was going to do nothing to change his mind. He ignored their findings. He conflated their calls for decriminalization, legalization, and said that he disagreed with that idea. Nothing happened. Marijuana remains a Schedule I drug today. But other people started reading the Schaefer Commission's report, which, as you can see here, was released in paperback, and it cost $1.25. So these findings were, if denied and discriminated against by the White House, they nonetheless found an active and an eager audience in the American public. And they realized that if they couldn't change laws on the federal level, they could start to change things on the state level. But before we get into that, we will talk about people who tried to change it on the federal level, because the beginnings of legal activism began in Washington, D.C. in 1970 by this young man here named Keith Straub. Keith Straub is a fascinating individual. He's still alive. He's still very involved with NORML, which is the organization he founded, the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, in 1970 in Washington, D.C. He started arguing for cannabis rights from a consumer rights angle. He had worked with Ralph Nader, and that was where he got inspired to take this approach. He argued that smokers were consumers, not criminals. He wanted to bring the drug above ground, get it into stores where it could be taxed and regulated, where production could have quality control, and where people could access the drug without turning to the black market. It is identical to the same arguments we hear for legalization today, but he was making them 50 years ago, which is pretty remarkable. NORML is still going strong. It has state chapters and a DC headquarters on H Street Northwest in DC. It's down the street from Madame Tussauds Wax Museum, which just makes me laugh. But anyway, Straub starts in 1970. He starts lobbying Capitol Hill to try to change these laws. And he is the center of federal activism in the United States. Meanwhile, a wave of young politicians are getting elected to state houses in 1972, and they're primed to take the Schaefer Commission's recommendations seriously on the state level. So starting in Oregon in 1973, and then over the course of the next 5 years, young politicians in a dozen states, some of which you'll notice are legalized or decriminalized today, they've decriminalized the possession of up to an ounce of marijuana, reclassifying it as a civil fine about the same as a speeding ticket. Suddenly, a third of the country, the same way a third of the country today, possession, or at least as he got caught. And it's an enormous shift. Oregon is the first, it's the bellwether. Other states wait to see what happens, to see if the sky falls. A year after Oregon decriminalizes, NORML sponsors a survey and says that things are actually okay, this is fine. You see a wave of states in 75, 76, 77. Alaska has an asterisk next to it because its shift was a constitutional rather than just a change in the law. So this is huge. And the reason this happens is because pot use is being painted as this fairly sympathetic action at the time. People talked about marijuana. The image of the pot smoker was a young, usually white, often a college kid, otherwise law-abiding. It was kids and young adults who were going to be productive members of society, and you didn't want to damage them, giving them a criminal record. They were doing it in the privacy of their own homes. They weren't hurting anybody else. It was very much so about civil liberties and of being allowed to do what you wanted to do in the privacy of your own home. This image and the argument around it were really influential, and they underscored the wave of marijuana acceptance. Even Jimmy Carter campaigned in 1976 on a platform of states' decriminalization rights. And in 77, after he was elected, he sent a letter to Congress declaring that laws against drugs, by drugs he meant marijuana, quote, should not be more harmful than the use of the drug itself, which was a clear signal he would support decriminalization nationwide. So you can see how by 1977, 1978, decriminalization supporters really kind of thought they had to fight. They had Carter in the White House, state laws in waves, very close to Carter's chief drug advisor, Peter Bourne. It seemed though the corner had been turned and it was just a matter of time nationwide and potentially federally. But it all grinds to a halt in late 1970s, and there are numerous reasons why. But the most important one is because the decriminalization movement basically shoots itself in the foot. So while decriminalization laws are spreading across the country, a new industry pops up alongside of it, and this is paraphernalia industry. Sales of pipes, bongs, rolling papers, toys, books, shakers, grinders, hiding places, paraphernalia-filled Christmas stockings, they all boom in the late 1970s. By 1977, sales of these legal items used to use an illegal substance hit 250 million a year, which is today's equivalent of 1 billion. And that means that paraphernalia earned more in 1977 than the release of the original Star Wars movie, which is to put things into perspective. And you have to remember that the economy in the 1970s is pretty bad, right? In 73 and 79, oil shortages caused gas lines to snake on the block. Carter introduces the term stagflation into the national lexicon, et cetera. But paraphernalia booms. And the reason it does is not only because more people are smoking, but because there's this growing drug culture and marketplace fueled by music, movies, and magazines like High Times. The premier issue is there on the right from the summer 1974. And these ads are from old issues of High Times, all of which are actually at the Library of Congress in other bound books. It's a great resource for researchers. And it feels very weird to read High Times in the Library of Congress, but it's also a lot of fun. So there's the Buzzbee, which is a Frisbee with a pipe in it. So you can literally puff, puff, pass. There's Rosie and Herbert, two clowns selling rolling papers. And this is just obviously a very small selection of a lot of the really unbelievable ads in these old magazines. And the problems with these ads, of course, is that they very clearly appeal to children. And this is the problem with decriminalization in the 70s as a whole. Decrim just doesn't have the same level of regulation and oversight that legalization has, nor does it create its own marketplace. So these magazines and really all this paraphernalia are available everywhere. You could get them at head shops, in record stores, magazines were at 7-Eleven, and there was no restrictions on who could buy these items. A 1978 New York Times report found that they sent 3 children, ages 11 to 13, around the city to buy as much paraphernalia as they could from with 3 worth of goods. And this is clearly a problem. Accordingly, rates of adolescent marijuana use also began to rise. So by 1979, 11% of high school seniors report smoking pot every day, and children as young as 13 report that the drug is easy to get. And this launches the first anti-marijuana counter-revolution. In 1976, when a woman named Marcia Mannett-Schuhard, who went by the nickname Keith, she's there on the left in the red, she discovered that her 13-year-old daughter was smoking pot in her backyard during the girl's birthday party. And Schuhard is fascinating because she is a researcher and an activist who becomes so passionate about preventing adolescent drug use that she launches a national grassroots campaign. She has a PhD in British literature from the University of Texas at Austin, and she was in Atlanta because her husband was teaching at Emory, and she was home with her 3 girls. So when her oldest daughter starts smoking pot, or she catches her smoking pot, and she realizes that her daughter's going through all these changes, she's more moody, she's more irritable, she blames the drug, Schuhard blames the drug, and she starts researching everything she can find about what marijuana's effects on children are. She doesn't find too much, but the reports that she does find are terrifying to her. She finds government reports that suggest that cannabis can make young boys grow breasts. They can render young girls infertile. They can destroy chromosomes, so generations of individuals will be impacted by the use. And the drug encourages amotivational syndrome, in which kids basically give up on life before it's really begun. Essentially recreates second wave feminism by creating consciousness raising groups in her living room. She invites all the other parents of kids who are at her daughter's birthday party to come over, and she shares this information with them. And she says, we've got to do something about this. This is an issue. So she bands together with the parents who are interested in the cause. They promote community-wide curfews, rules, restrictions. They give the kids alternative activities. They really create an environment where drug use is not something that is either accepted or allowed to basically happen. And it works. she ends up joining up with Thomas, nicknamed Buddy, everybody has nicknames, Buddy Gleaton at Georgia State University. And in 1978, they form PRIDE, the Parents Resource Institute for Drug Education, which then teaches parents nationwide about the dangers of adolescent marijuana use and how to form a parent group themselves. Atlanta is the hotspot of parent activism, not only because of PRIDE, but because Sue's neighbor, Sue Rushi, forms a parent group of her own called National Families in Action, which also educates parents about the dangers of marijuana, but it encourages communities across the country to form lobbying groups to lobby their state governments against paraphernalia. So they start really nailing the paraphernalia industry. And all of this culminates, and then in 1979, Schuhard releases the book in the center there called Parents, Peers, and Pot. Through NIDA, she becomes good friends with Robert DuPont. And this book gets requested over 1 million times, and it basically causes parent groups to form nationwide. They then meet, or this sort of culminates in what's called the National Federation of Parents for Drug-Free Youth, the NFP, which is down the street from in Silver Spring, Maryland, which is right across the border from DC. And they are perfectly lined up to join with Nancy Reagan when her husband gets elected to the office in 1980. So Nancy Reagan becomes the biggest name in adolescent drug abuse prevention. And she does this by working with parent activists to launch this incredibly maternal, very caring, coordinated campaign that teaches children to not use drugs in order to preserve the health and safety of America. No is actually a program that was started by an African-American grandmother in Oakland in 1984, and Nancy Reagan stole it and whitewashed it. That's chapter 10 of my book. We can talk about that in the Q&A as well. But Nancy Reagan used parent activist platform to elevate herself. She's very unpopular when her husband first elected, and she also turns it into basically a national cause. And she flips the decriminalization argument of the 1970s on its head. Whereas in the 1970s, pot was about an adult's right to do something in the privacy of their own home. Pot users were seen as otherwise law-abiding people. By the 1980s, an adult's right to smoke pot superseded by a child's far more important right to grow up drug-free. Because adult drug use had trickled down to kids, all adult drug users were criminals and they deserved to be locked up for their use. So just a decade after a wave of decriminalization laws made activists think that legalization was around the corner, marijuana had transformed into the nation's boogeyman. Almost all of the decrim laws were reversed, and arrest rates for possession rose from about 400,000 in 1980 to 455,000 in 82, and continued to rise almost till today. But this widespread demonization of pot ran into a roadblock in the mid-1980s when another drug debuted on the scene, and that drug was crack. Crack was so scary, tied to urban crime, obvious racial issues here, that it knocked marijuana from the headlines, and the view that marijuana was the greatest threat to America disappeared. It was obviously a very prominent media campaign. It was real world scary as opposed to just national focus on marijuana. Crack surprisingly did more for the legalization campaign than almost anything else, because it made pot seem tame in comparison, and it set the stage for marijuana's resurrection as a surprising substance, which was a medicine. So the crack crisis hit the United States at the same time when another epidemic was happening, which was HIV/AIDS. So in places like San Francisco, and then where dozens and then hundreds coming to were gay, drug users, so while crack lines and making everybody scared, thousands of people are dying from this new disease, and nobody respectable wants to get anywhere near it. But we see something remarkable evolve from this situation, which is that legalization activism then joins up with the gay rights movement and births what is essentially the modern medical marijuana movement. So you might know the name Robert Randall. He's on the top left. He was the first person to have the federal government recognize his use of marijuana for legitimate medical reasons, which for him was glaucoma. Dennis Perron on the top right in the center of his home-based marijuana supermarket in 1977, and Brownie Mary Rathbun there in the center are the Californians who combined medical marijuana with gay rights and brought to pass the nation's first medical marijuana law in 1996. Brownie Mary was so named because she had been baking brownies with a special ingredient. She lived in the Castro district, and when people around her started succumbing to AIDS, she started helping them by giving them brownies. The cannabis helped people who were dying of HIV/AIDS because it relieved a lot of their nausea and gave them back an appetite. It calmed some of their pain. It gave them a little bit more energy. And Rathbun started saying, this is the real and legitimate medicine. She started working with Dennis Perron. And in 1996, they were able to help with the passage of Prop 215, which allowed doctors in California to recommend the use of marijuana for patients suffering from any illness. By 1997, the New York Times reported that nearly a third of Americans knew someone who used pot for medical reasons, and marijuana had transformed again in just a decade, from 86 to 96, from a national scourge to a potential panacea, and the drug war began to change shape and turn. So suddenly people were less concerned about the victims of drug use than they were for the victims of the drug war, at least in terms of this specific substance. Everyone knew someone who had cancer, or they were struggling with some other disease that they could potentially benefit from using this drug. And now 35 states and DC recommend it, and over 80% of the American public approves. But this is not to say that people magically stopped being locked up for pot after the first marijuana laws were passed. They actually rose. In 2007, the year marijuana arrests peaked, over 872,000 people were arrested for pot. By 2010, a marijuana bust occurred nearly every 37 seconds. And the majority of people getting arrested were African-American males, who are nearly 4 times as likely to be arrested for pot than whites, even though people use the drug at basically the same rate. You're probably familiar with the book on the left, The New Jim Crow, which Michelle Alexander released in 2010. She basically argued that drug laws were responsible for incarcerating a greater percentage of the African-American population in the United States than in South Africa at the height of apartheid. And though she does not decriminalization is potentially useful for like helping state government budgets, people take the new Jim Crow and the 20 years of marijuana's use as a medicine to pave the way for recreational legalization. So there on the right, you can see the poster from the 2014 cannabis campaign to get DC to legalize marijuana. And the whole message is right there: legalization ends discrimination. There is this belief that legalizing this substance that incarcerates far more Black Americans than white Americans could do something to level the playing field, to reduce the effects of mass incarceration on the Black population. And there is this real like social justice initiative to pass recreational legalization. And it worked, right? You can see the support for this changing economy is growing by leaps and bounds. 83% of Democrats and 48% of Republicans support legalization right now. The cannabis retail sales are expected to boom. There is nothing but green skies ahead for what is known as the green rush. But I am hesitant to suggest that another shift will not come. For a social justice cause, there are financial fears that the industry is primarily owned by wealthy whites, primarily wealthy white men. There are concerns that legalization can't really address the racial playing field because African Americans continue to be arrested for possession at higher rates than whites, even in legalized states. There is fear of big marijuana. Ryan Stowe, who I know is going to be speaking at this conference as well, argues against pushing out small growers. There are groups like SAM, Smart Approaches to Marijuana, that are fundamentally opposed to, quote, as they say, preventing other big tobacco. There are a few parent organizations. And most of all, there are the environmental concerns that legal and illegal grows are huge carbon contributors. This is not a sustainable plant to grow. So I realize I'm probably out of time, and I really am excited to hear George. So I look forward to your questions, and we can talk more about it when we get to the Q&A. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Emily, for that terrific presentation. And now I'll turn it over to George Fisher.
Thank you, Jay. And let me say that I remember Jay very well from that class. It was the first evidence class I taught, the first class I ever taught at Stanford Law School. And now Jay has been teaching almost as long as I have been teaching, which is really stunning to realize. So I'm here to talk about the history of the earliest American anti-drug laws. And by that, I don't mean Richard Nixon and the 1970 Controlled Substances Act. I don't mean Harry Anslinger and the 1937 Marijuana Tax Act. And I don't even mean the 1914 Harrison Narcotic Act, because all of those cases of federal lawmaking were late to the game. By the time the Harrison Act in 1914 banned non-medical use of opium and cocaine, 35 states and territories already had banned non-medical use of opium, and 46 states or territories already had banned non-medical use of cocaine. And by the time of the 1937 Marijuana Tax Act, all 50 states and territories had banned non-medical use of cannabis. So we have to start in the states, and indeed we have to start right where I am sitting now, which is the city of San Francisco, which is the site of the first shot in the American War on Drugs, the 1875 San Francisco Ordinance Against Opium Dens. And when we go back to San Francisco here, we can begin to take up the theories of early anti-drug lawmaking in the United States, which had to do with race, prominently had to do with race, and boiled down to their essence, the idea was that because white lawmakers and their ilk despised the Chinese immigrants to the country, they banned opium dens that the Chinese laborers brought here. And because other white lawmakers despised African Americans who were thought more prominently than others to use cocaine, they banned the drug that despised group favored. And because white lawmakers despised the Mexican immigrants who came north into the country in the early 20th century, they banned the drug that those immigrants were thought to have brought with them, the marijuana that was associated with Mexican immigrants. And the theories behind these racially driven notions broke down into four parts. The most basic is we ban the drug of those whom we despise because we want to spite those groups. Somewhat more complexly was the notion that if we ban the drugs that despised groups to which despised groups are addicted, those groups will go home in search of a fix. A third theory propounded by economic historians is that white laborers of the American West, in particular regarding now smoked opium, feared the immigrant Chinese laborers who were pushing them out of many markets because the Chinese had greater stamina, they were better workers, they had more resistance to pain, and perhaps the theory then was that white lawmakers banned the smoked opium that those Chinese laborers used to deprive them of the unnatural advantage in having superhuman energy that put whites out of the labor force. And the fourth theory put forth by legal historians, and one I think that is perhaps most familiar today, is that we ban the drugs used by groups we despise in order to impose police discipline on those groups. All these theories are misguided. None of them actually applies to the early American war on drugs. Those early American anti-drug laws, whether they had to do with opium, cocaine, or cannabis, were all laws about whites. And in particular, they were about the morals of whites. They go back to an old moral notion that it's fundamentally sinful and should be criminalized to deprive oneself of one's reason in pursuit of pure pleasure. We can see the roots of this moral notion going back very far, but also perhaps more prominently, not quite so far, to early Christian notions with regard to sex, later Puritan notions with regard to drunkenness, and later, of course, the American laws and eventually laws around the world against what were deemed to be intoxicating drugs, drugs that deprive us of our reason in pursuit of pure pleasure. We should see that these theories are all wrapped together. But sex is wrapped up in reason deprivation, is wrapped up in euphoria seeking. And it's when those ideas all are brought together that we see these moral emotions coming together most clearly. So the white lawmakers of the American West in banning opium dens weren't concerned with the Chinese use of opium. They were concerned with white use of opium, and in particular with whites of their own sort, respectable whites, respectable white youth, especially young women. These were the objects of concern, as we will see. And it didn't matter who the source of the drugs was. It mattered who was using the drugs, and that was respectable whites. So we can see here now a picture of the first photograph I have of an opium den. This one dating from 1892, which is somewhat later than the earliest American law from 1875. But I just want to show you that this den, first of all, it's in full operation, but it's also occupied only by Chinese persons who are not the object of concern. You'll note that the opium was smoked lying down. That was because after smoking, people tended to conk out. That is, they were stupefied. So we see two of these moral notions wrapped together. Beds or bunks, suggestive of sexual promiscuity, and stupefaction, suggestive of reason deprivation. We'll see these ideas coming together. In 1875, in November, the mayor of San Francisco went to the Board of Supervisors and appealed to them about the worry that Chinese den keepers were selling opium to whites, and not only to whites, but white males and females of various ages, if you read in the middle of the last paragraph, from the schoolgirl to the more mature. These were the objects of concern. It took only a week for the Board of Supervisors to respond. A week later, a committee reported back to the board. The committee had already deliberated on this notion. They'd already investigated. They'd already confirmed that there were opium dens in operation, kept for the exclusive use of white men and women, that these dens were patronized, if we look in the last paragraph, by young men and women of respectable parentage and by young men engaged in respectable business avocation. And if we look at the very last line, they inhaled opium until a state of stupefaction is produced. We see these moral concerns focus on young whites. Now, the law itself did not focus on whites. The San Francisco Opium Dens Ordinance punished, in theory, any person who kept an opium den and any person who went to those dens to smoke opium. But that is not the way the law was either understood or enforced. Just weeks later, not even a whole month later, we see the report in the San Francisco newspaper of the first raid on an opium den under the new law, describing the law as the new ordinance against white persons who frequent opium dens. And the persons arrested here all had European names, except for the two Chinese persons who kept the den. But their crime was not being Chinese and not keeping an opium den, but selling to whites. Here we see a year later, the New York Times repeats a piece from the San Francisco newspaper, again referring to the law that punished any white person who smoked in an opium den or any white person who kept a den and allowed a white person to smoke there. That was the way the law was understood and enforced. Here is the chief of police, who was the chief of police even before the enactment of the 1875 ban. He was still the chief of police off and on, but until the 1890s, talking about the work of the police officers under his supervision, who said, as you can see in this last paragraph, so far as I know, there are no joints in Chinatown, meaning we've been successful where a white person can go and smoke. Of course the Chinese smoke. It has been decided we cannot hinder that. All we can do is to keep them from opening places where whites might resort to smoke. And it didn't matter who the sellers were. Here, shortly after, just less than 2 years after the enactment of the ordinance, a report in the Chronicle of the arrest of Mrs. Jenny Perkins, a white keeper of an opium den, who sold to other whites. A young girl named Maud Clifford, as you can see midway down, and 3 men of European names. And then, if you can see in the very end, a concern about the 3-year-old kid sleeping in the corner. They were the object of concern. Again, Mrs. Perkins in 1885 arrested again. This report talks about how she's been arrested over and over. If you see about halfway down, a gentleman living near, this is now a den that has moved out of Chinatown because the police have driven white smokers out of Chinatown. So those white smokers fled elsewhere in the city, and Mrs. Jenny Perkins followed them and opened a den elsewhere. A man living nearby complained that girls who were not possibly over 12 years of age standing in front of the place, sick and staggering from the effects of opium. A little bit later, toward the bottom third, that found in this den kept by Mrs. Jenny Perkins were three young and evidently intelligent and well brought up women. And then mentioned at the very end that in another den opened by Mrs. Perkins, the police had once found and arrested a well-known and wealthy lawyer, all respectable whites. In the San Francisco Chronicle, 5 years after the enactment of the Dens ban, we see 25 of the 40 cases reported in the Chronicle, all the alleged smokers were white. In 12 cases, at least some of the alleged smokers were white. Only in 3 cases were all the smokers found in the den Chinese and arrested. And if you might be thinking now that the concern here was not we hate the Chinese, therefore we'll close the dens, but we don't want their hands on our vulnerable young women. Our concern might be fear of miscegenation, a concern that modern historians have vetted over and over again and has no foundation in fact. Although there are scattered references, the history of the enforcement of these laws belies any concern with miscegenation. And as we can see, if we break down those same 40 cases a little differently, according to the presence of men and women, in 34 cases, all of the alleged smokers were male, and police busted those dens. And all but 3 of those cases, some of those males were white. We see again those same 3 cases involving all Chinese smokers. In 5 cases, some of the smokers were male and some female, all of them white. In only 1 case was a Chinese smoker involved together with a white woman, but even in there, those 2 persons were outnumbered by the 4 white men in the den. The fears of miscegenation are lacking. It's very unlikely that that Chinese man, in the presence of 4 white men, tried to take sexual advantage of those white women. Harry Hubble Kane is the first American expert regarding opium smoking, wrote this book, Opium Smoking in America and China, in 1882. He said that the laws against opium smoking that had been enacted and enforced in this country had their inception in the knowledge of the fact that male smokers, Americans, his word, his parentheses, were continually beguiling women and young girls to try the pipe and effected their ruin when they were under its influence. The concern was with seduction, but it was white on white seduction. Americans at the time was code for native-born whites, meaning native to America-born whites. Harry Hubble Kane published a very high-profile 1881 article in Harper's Magazine, accompanied by this sketch of a Chinese kept opium den. You can see the Chinese keeper of the den in the doorway. Every patron whose race can be discerned is Caucasian. There are white women, but they are with white men. And in the foreground, in the front left, you see a white woman reclined in the arms of her white man, smoking opium. And this again, the image of the concern. I'm going to have to skip more quickly through some of my other slides from other jurisdictions, but this was not just in San Francisco. The Harper's Magazine article appeared just a few months before the state of New York banned opium dens. In Nevada, opium den bans followed quickly after San Francisco's. Here, an 1876 article from Virginia City, Nevada, which had a major Chinatown. It was a major mining town. Chinese workers were prominently miners. And notice the last 4 lines. The San Francisco supervisors recently passed an ordinance ordering the arrest of any white person found in the opium house, and our board should follow that example. Not long later, this is February 1876, here we are in September 1876, there is now an ordinance We trust that our police department will be both vigilant and persevering in enforcing the ordinance designed to put a stop to the practice of white men and women going down to the opium dens in Chinatown. That's again Virginia City, Nevada. Its ordinance was a word-for-word copy of San Francisco's, written in race-neutral terms, but understood in racially coded terms. Never mind John, this really interesting line right in the middle of this paragraph. John was a slur applied at the time to Chinese males. Let him smoke his brains out if he likes, but stop young men, meaning white men, from forming a habit which is worse than death, especially stop young girls, meaning young white girls, from acquiring a taste that is sure to unfit them from filling any place that nature designed them for in life. In Boston, some years later, but just months before the state of Massachusetts banned opium dens, we have the Boston Globe calling on the legislature to take action, not because of the Chinese use of opium dens. If you read this middle paragraph, the use of opium was confined only to the Chinese. If it had been possible to confine the habit among their own race, the results of its introduction would not have been so deplorable. What we are concerned about is the opening of a new den in Boston that makes pretenses, a few claims to respectability. Reading this last paragraph, or young fellows, meaning young white men, polite white men. Fellows was a term for polite white men. Hoodlums was a term for impolite white men. Young fellows and girls can assemble and in private initiate themselves into the seductive charm of opium, a danger that threatens to end most disastrously. One last exhibit in the opium realm, Idaho. In Idaho, every white person who opens and maintains a den was criminalized, and every white person who buys it. This is the only example I have found in any American jurisdiction that was specifically race-coded and targeting whites. No, I have not found any that were specifically race-coded and targeting the Chinese. This law lasted 6 years, and for those 6 years, the territory of Idaho had no law banning the Chinese from keeping or visiting an opium den, even though Idaho had the largest share of Chinese as a proportion of its population of any state or territory in the country. Opium den lawmaking followed the Chinese East in ways that might be predictable. But see, here we have a map of Chinese immigration where they landed and became most numerous. And here we have the map showing them moving east with the railroads, with mining, and opium den laws following them. We might expect in the case of cocaine that had something to do with fear of African-American use, that these images of African-American residency in the country and where the top 5 states, the top 15 states, we might expect anti-cocaine laws to arise in the American Southeast, but they do not. They arose beginning in Oregon in 1887, traveling next to Montana in 1889, to Colorado and Illinois in 1897, and Massachusetts in 1898. Not until Louisiana later in 1898 banned cocaine do we begin to see some racial inflection, some anti-African American inflection in the history of the anti-drug lawmaking concerning cocaine. Cocaine came into this country 3 years before the state of Oregon banned it in 1884. It emerged in New York. It was a medical import made by the Merck Medical Company. It was an Austrian-German import into the United States, used in the United States exclusively in the initial months by doctors. And because it was an expensive drug, because its use in eye surgery and ear, nose, and throat procedures and in dentistry was extremely useful. Cocaine, when applied topically to mucous membrane tissue, is a local anesthetic, an extremely effective one, and therefore, but also an expensive one at the time. And therefore, for some number of years after the 1884 introduction of cocaine into the country, all of the reported addicts to cocaine were doctors, their wives, their girlfriends, pharmacists, their errand boys, and other moneyed individuals or individuals who had some medical connection and therefore access to medical cocaine. Because the drug remained for some time rather expensive. It took only 3 years for the state of Oregon to ban it. And that's because within a year, reports of its abuse began to emerge. And so we see here now, emerging in Chicago, not New York, although date-lined in New York, but talking about the New York Medical Society going to the legislature in New York and petitioning the New York legislature to create a law against the non-medical use of cocaine because they said cocaine had slipped from the medical mold and had become used as an exorant, meaning a recreational pleasure drug. And as you can see in the middle, the concern is that its success for medical purposes has led to a promiscuous and very hurtful rise as a swallowed exorant. So great has the demand for it become that in the form of chewing paste, it is on sale in most of the drug stores. The purveyors were not people selling cocaine on the street. There is no underground market that was the concern. It was the legal pharmaceutical market in cocaine that had become the concern, but it was creating addiction to cocaine, especially when used in the form of cocaine-laced chewing gums, which were much more pleasant to use than infected needles, which had up till then become the most prominent way of using cocaine. This article came out a week after the New York Times reported the first case of American cocaine recreational use, and that was a doctor, a Chicago doctor, hence the interest of the Chicago press, who had addicted himself and his family to cocaine. But the real poster child in anti-cocaine lawmaking was the young man who helped prompt the early 1897 enactment of Illinois' anti-cocaine law. Maxwell, who like Margaret Schuhart's daughter, whom Emily spoke of, became a poster child now for anti-cocaine lawmaking. Max was the errand boy of a pharmacist, and Max addicted himself to cocaine by sneaking some of the cold cure the pharmacist kept on hand, but basically cocaine snuff, much as cocaine is used today. It was snuffed up the nostrils to dry up the nostrils, relieve the symptoms of cocaine, and leave people feeling pretty good in general. Here is young Max, as pictured by the Chicago Tribune, both before cocaine, literally a poster child now, and after cocaine, before he's a hale, healthy, well-put-together young man. After he's wan, he's haggard, he's disheveled, even his bow tie is limping. If we now go to the case of cannabis, we might assume that if cannabis responded to concern of Mexican Americans, this would be the pattern of anti-Mexican American lawmaking in the state. Here is the pattern of Mexican immigration into the country. Here is the first state that banned cannabis, Massachusetts. Here are the first 5 states to ban cannabis in order, Massachusetts in 1911, and 4 tightly bunched states 2 years later in 1913, Wyoming, 2nd, Indiana, 3rd, Maine, 4th, California, 5th. California was the only state that had an appreciable percentage of Mexican immigrants, 2% as measured in the census, no doubt an undercount. 2% in California, 0.2% in Wyoming, 0.003% in Indiana, 0.001% in Massachusetts, and in Maine, the population of Mexican Americans, according to the 1910 census and the 1920 census, fell by 50% from 4 individuals to 2 individuals. So why did these states act out against cannabis? It had nothing to do with Mexican immigration. The evidence of that is quite clear. In Massachusetts and in Maine and in Vermont, which became the 5th state to ban cannabis in 1915, and in Rhode Island, which became the 10th state to ban cannabis in 1918, all of those 4 New England laws traced to one organization, the New England Watch and Word Society, an offshoot of Anthony Comstock's New York Society for the Prevention of Vice, which had the New England organization had as its mission statement the removal by both moral and legal means of those agencies which corrupt the morals of youth. And when the secretary of that organization, who initiated the lawmaking campaign in Massachusetts and in Maine, who prompted it in Vermont, and may have prompted it in Rhode Island, said what prompted him into action to act out against drugs was a mother who came to him complaining about her son who was hooked on cocaine. In the course of banning of many drugs in Massachusetts, he wrote the law and he took it to the legislature a law that the Massachusetts legislature adopted almost unchanged in 1911, banning cannabis. He also published, this same man published a pamphlet containing what became almost word for word the Maine law of 1913. And both Massachusetts law and Maine law contributed to the Vermont law of 1915. And probably they all contributed, although the record is a little less clear, to the Rhode Island law of 1918. I don't have time to go through the lawmaking in the other states pictured in this, the lower of these two maps, but I can assure you that in Indiana and in Wyoming, there was also no hint in 1913 of Mexican bias driving the lawmaking. And in California, there is a hint, but almost surely not a dominant. Almost surely the lawmaking arose from other concerns, and not at all concern about Mexican Americans bringing in and abusing cannabis in this country. And if I can end by disabusing those who have read modern historians of two other notions, I'd like to take us to a different poster boy, the 19-year-old Victor Fiorito Licata, who took up an axe while apparently high on cocaine, on cannabis, allegedly high in marijuana, and murdered three siblings and two parents. Harry Anslinger, the first head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, the long-acting head from 1930 to 1962, talked about Victor Licata often. And it's alleged that Harry Anslinger leveraged race in the fight against marijuana and leveraged race in the campaign to get Congress to adopt the 1937 Marijuana Tax Act. And indeed, Victor Licata was an exhibit in Harry Anslinger's propaganda war in favor of this lawmaking effort. But he never showed in public this mugshot of Victor Fiorito Licata, which was found in Harry Anslinger's files at Penn State University. He never mentioned Victor Fiorito Licata's name, although that might have been something that many of you listeners might have mistaken as a Mexican name. He talked about Victor Licata only in terms of the man's age, either 19 years old, or sometimes he, I think, incorrectly referred to him as 20 years old. And Harry Anslinger leveraged very prominently a piece of propaganda, a magazine article titled "Marijuana Assassin of Youth," in which he talked about how young people were using marijuana, never talked about young Mexicans using marijuana. And even when talking about purveyors of marijuana in this article, he talked about over 24 purveyors of marijuana. In two of them, he used an ethnic shout-out, calling those marijuana purveyors tamale salesmen. Now, that is a pretty clear reference to Mexican. But elsewhere in that article, he referred time and time again to those who sold to youth. And when testifying before Congress, he referred time and again to the concerns of youth. And I could actually count up and tell you about how many times. But instead, I'd like to give one last exhibit, the film Tell Your Children, later known as Reefer Madness, also thought to be part of Harry Anslinger's race-based propaganda war against marijuana. Wrongly thought to have been released in 1936 in the run-up to the 1937 Marijuana Tax Act. Actually released almost surely in 1939, at earliest in late 1938. It wasn't completed till 1938, late 1938. It came out not under the title Reefer Madness, given into it now when it's become a cult classic, but under the title Tell Your Children. And as you can see from both the prologue, the rolling credits at the start of the film, and the epilogue delivered in a very ominous tone at the end of the film, the concern was with the viewers, children, your child, your dog, or yours. And the concern was not that they would go to Mexican-American sellers of the drug. That was never mentioned in the film. There's no reference to the Mexican origin of the drug or to Mexican purveyors. There are no Mexicans on screen. There is no racial mixing on screen. There are white purveyors. There are white youth using the drugs. There's one man of about Mr. Licata's complexion who's called Hot Fingers Peroni. He's the piano player in the malt shop where the respectable, clean-shaven, and cleanly dressed young white folks, boys and girls, go after school He's the piano player who tokes between sets, but he never interacts with the youth, the white youth, in any other way, certainly not in a sexual way, not in purveying marijuana to them. He's the only not light-skinned person on screen. And if you look at this, my last exhibit, an early ad selling this movie under the title Tell Your Children. And you can see in the top right, the theme is promiscuity. Marijuana sows the seeds of lust in youthful brains, takes the brakes off young morals, demands a terrible price for a thrill. And with that, I will conclude. I'm sorry for going over time. Thank you for your attention.
Terrific. Thank you so much for that presentation. We'll now move into the Q&A portion. I mean, one thing that I would invite both panelists to do, if you have any questions or comments on each other's presentations that you'd like to make, certainly feel free to do that as I take a look at the Q&As here.
Well, I guess I should just apologize because I said Reefer Madness came out in 1936. George, I'm so embarrassed. 1939. I'm sorry. My apologies for getting the date wrong.
My apologies for mentioning that, but let me also say how much I completely agree with you about the theory of the present legalization movement, how much I think Michelle Alexander indeed had to do with sparking that movement.
George, I have a question just a quick question that occurred to me. It's often said that the word marijuana was used instead of cannabis at around the time that you're talking about, because it's it was meant to invoke Mexican cannabis, right? I mean, so it was a racialized use. Is that what does your research show about the transition from using the word cannabis to marijuana?
But it's certainly true that Harry Anslinger spoke of marijuana, and it's certainly true that by the 1930s, marijuana was the term popularly used. But of those first 5 states that I talked about and studied most carefully, none of them in the law referred to marijuana. They referred to cannabis. In the case of California, there was a reference to loco weed, which probably was a shout out to marijuana and probably had something to do with the perceived Mexican origin of the law. But there is some ambiguity about that. But none of those other 4 states, the first 4 states to ban cannabis, referred to it otherwise than as cannabis in their lawmaking, or as Indian hemp, which therefore is a reference much more prominently to hashish, which probably was really the concern in sparking the earliest anti-cannabis laws in the country.
Thank you. Emily, are you? Oh, okay. So here's a viewer asked the question. Would be interested in the speaker's take on smart approaches to marijuana, and their take. The questioner is interested specifically in your take on, Sam, and how smart approaches to marijuana seems to have achieved instant credibility while being opaque on their funding. And somebody else, let me also mention, Sam, Michael Cutler, who is a long veteran of marijuana law, practiced marijuana law for many years, and was also a BU law graduate, asks makes a comment saying, "I doubt the risk of an abated green rush will occur given the initiative results in San Diego and Montana, and SAM's minimal impact despite its funding and visibility." So I guess the question is, if anybody has any views about smart approaches to marijuana and whether they will be a major player coming in the next few years, et cetera. I suppose, Emily, this might be first directed to you.
Sure. I talked to Kevin Sibet when I was researching grassroots. Back when it was Project Sam, now it's just Sam. And Kevin really disliked my book, and has not spoken to me since. I think Sam is interesting because it really very small shop. It's Kevin, and he had 2 staff back when I spoke to him in 2016. I think he has about the same now. But he has changed his approach over the past 4 years. Before it was, why do we need to legalize a third intoxicant? This seems unnecessary. It's dangerous for kids. With the same approach that has for decades. So, take
You're drifting in and out, Emily.
commercial.
Oh. Emily, we're having trouble hearing you. I don't know. If
Yeah. Oh dear.
There you are. You're back.
Oh, okay, good. Sorry about that. So now Sam's approach the past couple of years has shifted to one where they are surprisingly anti-capitalist. They are interested in preventing another big marijuana. They are in some ways supportive of social justice initiatives in that they're concerned that most dispensaries are opening in minority neighborhoods. Sabet gets his credentials from having consulted the ONDCP under 3 different administrations. But I don't know. I do think that they are, if the Twitter comments are any indication, and I realize this is anecdotal evidence, but whenever he posts anything, people give him a lot of strong pushback. I don't see the main thrust of blowback against legalization coming from him. I think he's just
well, we lost that last part, which I think was really
being. Oh, sorry. So I think.
Oh no. I think Zoom doesn't want you to make the point.
As the person willing to take on the public mantle. Oh, Zoom, come on. So that's the person who's willing to take on that public mantle of being. Can you hear?
No, I didn't really hear the last part of that answer, unfortunately. There may not be anything we can do.
I'll type it in the chat.
Oh, okay, that's a great idea.
Okay, I'll type it in the chat.
We have about another minute or
Okay.
two. If anyone has a question, here's a question. Do you know? Oh, this is referring to Alaska's decriminalization. The question is, do you know if there's any particular influences that led to Alaska taking the extra step of adopting a constitutional amendment for decriminalization? I guess that's for Emily, perhaps, or George, anybody.
Yeah.
Mhm.
The reason was because it was the activist. He was instrumental in doing that. I guess
George,
you can't hear me. Can you hear me?
Well, maybe you could say the answer to that one more time. It seemed quick.
Sure. The reason is because it was the activist for a constitutional amendment as opposed to just a law shift.
Okay. Any other questions coming in the Q&A? I think, if not, let me just check one more time. Oh, sorry. Emily has written in the chat about Sam. I don't think Sam will be the force for pushback, but I do think he is willing to take on the public role of being the most visibly anti-legalization person in America. Okay. Well, thank you very much. I think with that, we'll end the session. It was very, very interesting. I learned quite a lot. Thank you so much, both of you, for participating. And the conference now takes a pause until, let me check, until 2:30, where we will return with panel number 5 on marijuana and social equity. So thank you very much, and have a great weekend. Farewell.
Thanks, Jay. And thank you, Nate. And Emily, great to meet you.
Thank you.